Good morning.
Good morning. Wow, where are you joining us from?
Okay, I'm joining you from Maryland.
Okay, US. Okay, great to have you here.
Thank you.
Um, Good evening, Dania, Prof.
Good evening.
Agaku.
Hello,
How are you doing, sir?
I'm alive and well. How are you?
Very well, thank you. So thank you so much for joining us, everyone. If there are people joining us for the first time, just to let you know that the session will continue up until we complete the Q&A session. But you're welcome to leave as soon as Prof finishes his presentation, or of course at any time if you need to. But just letting you know that um, our sessions tend to be very long, mainly because of the Q&A session. So you're welcome to leave at any time during that point. We will issue certificates, let's say by next Friday. Hello, Chie. Welcome. We're always happy to have first timers. So we will share certificates next week, let's say by Friday, but we need you to provide your full name and your email address. This is done through the attendance register, which we will share at the end of the presentation. So we will not share it anytime before Prof finishes his presentation, because obviously if you have at least gained some knowledge, it would be after the presentation. So please provide your name and email address. We will share it in the chat box, and we will announce this when we do it. So without a further waste of time, and everyone will be muted, of course, we will record the session. We'll share the links. All our sessions are always available on YouTube. On our YouTube channel, we will share the links. So at any time, you can access them at any time, even during the session, if you want to see if it's really there. Because as soon as we go live, then the recording will be live on YouTube as well as LinkedIn. And what else, Prof, am I leaving?
Nothing.
The introduction.
No. Please no.
And if there are slides, we will also post them on our LinkedIn page. Please do follow us if you're joining us for the first time. Follow us on LinkedIn. We will share our links throughout the session. So just to introduce Prof. Agaku, he is an adjunct clinical professor at the University of California in San Francisco. For close to a decade, he served as a senior scientist at the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. He completed his dental training at the University of Ibadan and his dental public health residency at the US NIH. He holds a master's degree in public health from Harvard University and 2 PhDs, one in epidemiology and another in health systems. Dr. Agaku is the editor-in-chief for the Journal of Tobacco-Induced Diseases. He has authored over 160 manuscripts in peer-reviewed journals and has also served as an associate editor for the US Surgeon General Report. Dr. Agaku is a diplomat of the American Board of Public Health, Dental Public Health, an expert in data science and artificial intelligence. Dr. Agaku is the founder, CEO, and Chief Scientific Officer of Chisquares, a startup focused on building cutting-edge scientific tools. Thank you, Dr. Gaku.
I love when that happens.
And start.
That way you refrain from reading that extremely long narrative. Okay.
I always need some water after traveling.
That is hilarious. All right, welcome to our session. We will be covering today and tomorrow the design and conduct of case control studies. Case control studies are an extremely important design in epidemiology. And so the goal is that over the next 2 days, we're going to distill the essence, the most important things you need to absolutely know about the design and the conduct of case control studies. I want to keep it very simple. We're going to make sure everybody understands. So there is no assumption of knowledge here. All right. Here's a picture that tries to, in a very simple way, summarize some of the more familiar study designs that we might know of. If we imagine that the red, what do you call this now, puzzle is the exposure and the green one is the outcome, then you can see how the different studies behave in terms of how we capture the red and the green together. So for example, in cross-sectional studies, we are capturing the exposure and the outcome at the same time. That's why we call it cross-section. You take a cross-section and everybody's captured simultaneously, right? Obviously, the challenge with that is we don't know, did the green one come before the red one, or did the red one come before the green one? Well, the answer is we don't know. So cross-sectional studies, they pose a dilemma because of the chicken and the egg scenario. Did the chicken come before the egg, or did the egg come before the chicken? We don't know, right? But the bottom line is that in cross-sectional studies, both the exposure and the outcome are measured at the same time in a single snapshot of time. In a cohort study, we start with the exposure, right? The exposure is in one hand, but on the other hand, we don't have the outcome yet. And the goal is to figure out the outcome. So what do? We start with what we have in our hand, and we follow people over time such that we look at exposed and non-exposed groups and see over time who has developed more of the outcome, which group has had a higher percentage of those who've developed the outcome. So that's what we're doing with a cohort study. We're starting with the exposure in hand. So we have groups that are exposed versus non-exposed. And what we don't have is outcome. And that's what we're trying to figure out. And that's why we follow people over time. That's a cohort study. Now, when you flip a cohort study, you get what we call a TROHawk study. TROHawk is simply when you read cohort backwards, that gives you TROHawk. So that's one of the names for a case control study. A case control study is also called a TROHawk, because unlike a cohort, we have in our hand the outcome. And now we're trying to figure out what is the exposure. So now we have the outcome and we're trying to go back in time to figure out, okay, this is the outcome, but what led to this outcome, right? So this is a very simplistic way of summarizing those three major study designs and trying to understand what they are in a snapshot. And it should be immediately clear to us that since in a TROHawk study or a case control study, we have the outcome, and we're trying to figure out what the exposure is, the limitations of the case control study should be immediately obvious from just this representation. Because here you have individuals who have the outcome and some who do not have the outcome. And you're trying to compare these two to say, I wonder why this guy had the outcome, but this other one did not have the outcome. I wonder what exposure might be different between them. But as you can imagine, when somebody has an outcome, the way they view life is different. Like if you are suddenly diagnosed of cancer today, you would think very differently in terms of you're just there wondering, I wonder whether it was this thing that led me to develop this outcome. So having the outcome automatically rewires how you think. And so there we see challenges already in the kinds of biases that might creep in with regards to TROHawk studies, also called case control studies. Now let's see where case control studies sit. Let's see where those other studies that we mentioned sit in the evidence pyramid. I'm sure you've all seen this pyramid or this chart. This tells us the gradation of evidence based on internal validity, right? So based on internal validity, we see that the king of the hill is randomized controlled trials. And at the very bottom, we have case reports. Case reports are studies of one person. So if we had, let's say, the first case of Ebola for example, in this county, we might talk to that person, collect a lot of information about their symptoms and this and that. That's what we call a case report. It's a one-person study. And all the way here, we have randomized trials, which are experiments. And then we see nested in here, we have case control. They're not at the very top, they're not at the very bottom, right? So all the studies are both case control studies are what we call analytical studies, right? So this from case control and upwards are analytical. Analytical means comparative. So we're comparing two groups to see how an outcome variable differs between the two groups. So we see that case control study in terms of ranking is lower than cohort studies because of some of the issues we mentioned. Case control studies are retrospective. Again, going back here, we see that with cohort, we're moving forward in time to see what happens to these individuals who are exposed or non-exposed. With TROHOC or case control studies, we're going backwards, retrospective in nature. Now, this is to now formally just explain how we classify studies in epidemiology. So we start by asking that are groups being compared by exposure status? Are we comparing groups? If the answer is no, then we say the study is descriptive. So descriptive studies, essentially what they do is just to describe or quantify a burden of an outcome in terms of person, place, and time. So when we go back to this study here, we're just trying to say, okay, we've gathered a cross-section of the population, and we're interested in knowing, oh, what percentage report this, and how does that differ among subgroups, right? That's descriptive epidemiology. If the study is analytical, the question we're then asking is, who assigned people into study groups? Is it the investigator or is it the nature or nurture? There are three things that could assign people to interventions or to a group. They are nature, nurture, or the investigator. Nature is things that we had no control over, that we are born with. For example, you did not determine your race. You did not determine where you were born, for example. So we can classify those as nature. Nurture is the environment. So the food you eat, your exercise regimen, and so on and so forth. And then the investigator is the person conducting the study. So if assignment was done by nature or by nurture, then we say that the study is observational. So if I'm doing a study, for example, to look at how your place of birth influences your height, for example, that would be an observational study because it was not the investigator that said Mr. A should be born here and Mr. B should be born there. It was nature. Or if I'm doing a study looking at the impact of obesity on your health outcomes, again, it was not the investigator that assigned people to be obese or non-obese. It was our lifestyle choices. So in this case, nurture. So whenever it is nature or nurture that assigns people into groups, we call that study observational. And it's called observational because the investigator is just chilling and observing. They're not intervening. They are just observing what's happening and taking notes. However, if the investigator was the one that assigned treatment, then we call that an interventional study. And if that assignment was at random, then we call it a randomized trial. If it was not random, we'll call it a non-randomized trial. So that's how we classify studies. Now, people always get confused between the differences across these three study types: retrospective cohort studies, prospective cohort studies, and case control studies. So this is my favorite analogy to explain the differences among the three. In this illustration, one thing is always consistent, that the ingredients will always come before the meal. So we have the same ingredients in all three cases. We have the same meal in all three cases. What is different, however, is where the investigator appeared. In a prospective cohort study, I call a chef to come and cook a meal for me. And I am with the chef at the very beginning. I see how they're mixing things and how the dish is being prepared. I am watching with my own two eyes, right? I see how all of these things come together. And so the dish is made. I don't have to rely on someone to tell me what happened because I was there. That's what a prospective cohort study is. In a retrospective cohort study, again, the chef comes, mixes the ingredients together. This time, however, I was not there with the chef at the beginning. However, I left a recording device to capture everything that was happening so that when I come back after the meal is cooked, I see the meal, but I can go and watch the recording to see how everything was prepared. So that's the same thing that happens in a retrospective cohort. We're not there at the beginning, but there are records that we can go and review as though we were there and follow the individuals exposed or non-exposed over time, right? So that is a retrospective cohort. Our focus today, however, is on the third scenario. Again, the chef came, prepared his thing, and made a dish. We came at the end. Now, this time around, there's no recording. There's no, we have to, from the dish, we have to reverse engineer this dish and say, I think this guy used onions in this dish because this looks like an onion, right? That's how we do case control studies. We are starting with the outcome and trying to figure out what went into this outcome, what caused it, right? So that's a case control study. And this is a framework that allows you to think of how you want to decide whether you wish to implement a prospective cohort, a retrospective cohort, or a case control study. If we had all the time and money in the world, we will always do a prospective cohort, right? In epidemiology, we always joke that a case control study is a poor man's version of a cohort study, right? So if you had all the time and the money in the world, yeah, we would always do a cohort study and we would follow people over time. It doesn't matter how rare the disease is. We will just follow people forever and ever and ever until we have what we want. If we had, unlimited time and money. Unfortunately, we don't have unlimited time. If you apply for an NIH grant, it's going to be like, okay, how long is this study? 5 years, not forever. So we're always constrained by money and by time. So that's not an option. The idea of unlimited money or resources is not a thing. All right. So now we have established that we don't always have unlimited time and money. So if that is the case, we're constrained. Next question is, what do you have in hand? Let's go back to our picture here. So look in your hands, what do you have in your hand? Do you have a well-defined exposure, and you're trying to figure out the outcome? Or is it that you have a well-defined outcome and you're trying to figure out the exposure? So what is in your hands? If I have cases, well, that's clear to me that I should do a case control study and then figure out what the outcomes are. So with well-defined cases, I will do a case control study. With well-defined exposures, and I'm trying to find the outcome, I'll do a retrospective cohort. And if I'm not sure, well, then the next question is to ask, well, what do I want to find? What do I want to investigate? If I am interested in one outcome and I'm trying to see multiple exposures, because I may have a study, for example, let's say retractions. I'm interested in what factors are associated with retractions. And there are many exposures. There are many factors that could be responsible for that one outcome. It could be use of ChatGPT. It could be, scientific misconduct. It could be so many things. In that kind of case, I have one outcome, which is retractions, but there are many, many things that could have led to retractions. So in that case, a case control study will be appropriate. But if I have multiple outcomes and one exposure, then in that case, a retrospective cohort study might be more appropriate. And then if I have one outcome and one exposure, then I have choices. I can use a case control, I could use a cohort. So the question that then matters is, am I able to construct a historical cohort? Remember that with a retrospective cohort study, we are going back in time. Remember, it's like we're watching a recording, right? We're going back to the start of the recording and watching the video as though we were there. That means that in a retrospective cohort, you must be able to define a historical cohort and go to the start of that cohort as it were and follow them. So if you cannot define a historical cohort and say, these are the people, if you cannot define a block of time, and that block of time doesn't have to be calendar time, it could be time defined by calendar date, great, if you have that, or by an event. I might be interested in all people who were born in January between this date, right? That is a well-defined event. Or I might say all people who were enrolled in, let's say, university between so and so, or enrolled in, or who worked in so and so mining industry between so and so date. In all of these cases, I am able to clearly define a cohort that I can go to the start and say, okay, who and who and who were in this historical cohort. If you can't do that, then you can't do a retrospective cohort, right? So those are constraints that you need to be aware of. And so if you can, then your best option will be a case control study. Now let's look at some of the principles of case control design, the things we want to avoid, and the things we want to execute. So imagine that you have a puzzle in your hand. Remember we said that it takes two to tango. So you have the cases in your hand and you want to match them, right? Well, you want to obviously set some criteria for it to match. You can say, okay, I'm holding a green puzzle in my hand. Obviously, for it to match, it has to be the same size and it has to be the same fit. Then it's a match. So you have set some criteria for matching, right? But you don't have a huge laundry list of them. A bad option will be to have this long laundry list where you're saying, well, for me to match a puzzle to this green one, I am looking for a red one that is of this size and of this fit and has this texture and has this smell and has all this list of things. Well, the problem is that you will never find this. You may never be able to find one that meets all these criteria. And what's the result? Well, you end up with a case that you can't find a matching partner for. And that's a wasted case, because case control study means that for every case, you must have at least one control. So when you have a case that you can't find a control for, well, it's a waste. And why is it a waste? What's the root cause? Well, it's because of your excessive specificity, right? You have overmatched and you have all these criteria that are unreasonable. And so you cannot find a control. So the moral of the story is that you want to be very reasonable in your matching. You don't want to overmatch. Overmatching will lead to extreme degrees of inefficiency, where you have cases that don't have a control because of your requirements. So let's not do this. Now, another scenario could be that we want to match. Remember that we want to match for every green, we want to match a red. That's how they come, green and red. However, you can see in this jar that you have some browns, right? Remember, green plus red equals brown. And this is a case where you have some of the controls share similar exposure as the cases, right? You have sampled in a way that selection of controls is not independent of exposure, right? So imagine a scenario like this. Let's look at it this way. You're supposed to have cases and controls that are very distinct. And this is why we say, make sure you don't compare. This is one case where you want to compare apples and oranges, right? Cases are apples, controls are oranges. So the only way you make sure you do this is to ensure that your selection of controls is independent of the exposure. You don't want to go to the same bar to go and look for cases and controls. The same bar that you saw cases, not that same bar or restaurant that you want to go and look for controls, put mildly, right? Because what happens when you don't do that? Well, you see that the controls begin to look like the cases. This is what happens when you fail to sample or select controls in a manner that is independent of the exposure, right? You can see that the controls begin to look like the cases. Let's take an example. Let's say that you wish to look at oral cancer. That's what you're studying. You've selected, or let's say lung cancer, something that is dramatically associated with smoking. That's your case, right? People who have developed lung cancer. Now, we're saying that selection of controls in a case control study must be done in a way that is independent of the exposure. So what that means in simple English is that the way you select controls should not be in a way that is associated with smoking, right? So it would be a bad idea to go to, for example, a nightclub and say, hey, I want to select controls from here, especially if the nightclub is in the state of Georgia, where everybody smokes, right? Why? Because you'll find that your controls are very likely to be smokers as well. So now, instead of selection of controls to be independent of the exposure, you're selecting them in a way that is similar. The controls you're selecting are kind of similar to your cases. So here, instead of being this, you're having a scenario where, well, this guy smokes, right? So maybe long term, he's going to be it's very similar to the case. And when this happens, you can see that the contrast between the cases and the controls begin to disappear. The controls begin to look more and more like the cases. And what happens is that the differences between them begin to disappear. They're looking like the same thing, right? And this creates a bias towards the null. Why towards the null? Because null means nothing. In other words, there is nothing that is different between these cases and the controls, right? So when you select, we're saying that the selection has to be independent of the exposure. So you have to be very extremely careful in selecting, in determining the areas where you're going to select your controls. So back to the lung cancer example. If I'm going to select controls, I don't want to go to an accident and emergency ward of the hospital to select controls. Why? Because it's very likely that people who are in accidents and emergency are people who are drinking and smoking and hence had an accident, right? If that is the case, then that means that selection of my controls was not done in a way that was independent of the outcome of interest in this case. So that is one of the most important rules of selecting controls in the case control study. Now, another thing we want to pay very close attention to is ensuring that now you don't see this with your two eyes, but this is what happens in the software when case control data have been analyzed. We need what we call discordant pairs, right? But before we go to the technical aspect of it, let's look at just these images. Which of these two puzzles will fit and why? Who can tell us? Which set will fit and which ones will not fit? And why do you say so? Longly, people able to answer?
Prof, do you want them to speak? Okay.
Yes, please, yeah.
David?
Hello?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I think the one to the left of the screen.
Okay.
Because it has where they're supposed to fuse complement each other.
Exactly. So that is the exact same thing, right? In your case control study, what we want is discordant pairs. It does not help us if you have concordant pairs. See, here they are the same thing, two crazy people cannot be a married couple, right? They will just kill each other, right? One side always has to be the opposite of each other in life and everything, everywhere else. Even in case control studies, you need the pairs to be discordant, not concordant, right? Now, when you're sampling, obviously you don't know whether they're going to be discordant. So in other words, what we're saying is that here's what happens when your software is analyzing the data for a case control study. It takes the entire data set and it's going to create mini data sets, small data sets. Each case and everybody that was matched to that case becomes like a mini data set. So if you had one-to-one matching, your software is now taking that small mini data set and saying, I have a case here, I have a control here. Do they have the same exposure? If they have the same exposure, that means that they are a concordant pair, which is a scenario like this. We cannot get any useful information from that, right? We can only get information that is meaningful when it's a discordant pair. Because because my research is all about examining differences and what happens when two groups are different. If they're all the same, we can't there's nothing that gives us information there. For us to get any useful information, they must be different. We must have discordant pairs, right? So when you have a case matched to a control and they have both are exposed or both are unexposed, either way, we have a concordant pair and that's useless to us, right? But remember that at the very beginning, you don't know. This is what's happening in your software at the background, right? You don't know upfront whether you're going to end up with concordant or discordant pairs. But you want to make sure that you avoid getting concordant pairs. So how do you then deal with that? Remember that you don't know upfront when you're selecting controls or cases or matching controls to cases. You don't know whether a particular case and its control will end up being concordant or discordant. So my question to you is, how do you increase the likelihood that for a particular case, you will find at least one control that is discordant with it in terms of the exposure? How do you do that? Any thoughts? Okay, here's a hint. How do you ensure when you are, a job interview is like a fit, right? We want to make sure that there is a fit between the employer and the employee. But if you go to any one particular job interview, there's no guarantee that that fit is going to happen. So how do you optimize your likelihood of success? Well, you have multiple tries. You interview here and you interview there and you interview there, and you hope and cross your fingers that at least one of those things will work out. That's what we do in real time, in real life. And that doesn't only apply to interviews. Any scenario where we're trying to optimize the likelihood of a match, well, we do multiple tries and hope that at least one of them will work out well, right? This is the exact same thing in case control studies. This is why we don't recommend that you do a one-to-one matching where you match one control to one case. Well, what if you match the one control to one case and it's concordant? Then you are really screwed at that moment because you have lost information. There's no information to be gained from that, right? And that's why we recommend that you have multiple controls matched to one case. So if the first one is concordant, well, hopefully the second one will be discordant. And at least one of them, right, will be discordant because that is the only scenario then where we can get useful information for that matched pair, which is a case and control. In general, we recommend a ratio of 4 controls to 1 case. Anything beyond that becomes inefficient because you're likely going to get a discordant pair with that ratio. But it's very risky just doing a 1-to-1 ratio because you might end up with pairs that are all, well, not all, perhaps that's an exaggeration, that are all concordant. And then your struggles have just begun. Because remember, when you were doing your sample size calculation at the beginning, you assumed that there will be discordant pairs. And so sampling that ratio allows you to make sure that it allows some certainty that you're going to end up with discordant pairs, that at least one of those will end up discordant. Now, the study design of a case control study is not different from other studies in that we also have to worry about the PICO framework. We've talked a lot about PICO in the past. Population intervention, comparison, outcome, time, and study design. So like any other study, we have to define our population. We have to worry about the outcome and its exposure. Obviously, in a case control study, this I will be switched to E because we don't have interventions in case control studies. They are just observational studies. So, but again, we have to clearly define each of those things very, very clearly. We'll look at a case study now where we'll go through that process of defining them meticulously. And again, like every other study, we have to define our inclusion and our exclusion criteria. For those of you who are attending our classes for the first time, inclusion criteria is like putting your arms around a group and saying that everybody who is in my embrace is included in the study or is screened in by the inclusion criteria. And everybody who is outside this embrace is screened out by the inclusion criteria. So in this picture, this line, this green line is my inclusion criteria, and everything within this green line has met the inclusion criteria. And all the red guys that are outside of this green line have been screened out by the inclusion criteria. The exclusion criteria, however, says, well, among those who have met the inclusion criteria, let's look at those who need to be tossed out for one reason or the other, right? And so when we're doing a case control study, obviously, we also have to clearly define our inclusion and our exclusion criteria. So what are some of the greatest mistakes people make when conducting case control studies? One, please don't be the guy with the hammer to whom everything is a nail. There are times when you should use a cross-sectional study. There are times when you should use a case control study. You need to know the difference and when to use one design over the other. But the far most common problem is overmatching. You read studies where people give you a very long list of items where they matched. The problem of overmatching is multiple. One is gross inefficiency, right? When you overmatch, you end up with scenarios. You can be doing a ratio of, for example, whatever ratio you're using, but you end up with scenarios where you have cases that simply cannot have a control. It's like somebody wanting to find a marriage mate and they have 20 criteria. It must be 6 foot tall. They must be a billionaire. It's like, oh, well, you might have a long wait, right? Because there are not a lot of people who meet that extensive list of criteria you have. It's the exact same thing when you have overmatching in your case control study. You simply end up with cases that don't have control. And it's inefficient and wasteful because sometimes to find one single case is a lot of work. Imagine you go to an old hospital where they have a lot of paper records and you have to manually search. And after a whole day's work, you find one case. Now imagine how ridiculous it is when you cannot find the control for that case because of overmatching. That makes no sense. So we want to be very efficient in how we select criteria for matching. Selection of controls in a manner that is associated with exposure. That is another pretty common error that you see a lot in the design of case control studies. Selection of controls in a manner that is not reflective of the source for the cases. I cannot emphasize this enough. It's like, let's go back to some of these images we had here. When you're selecting a control, it has to be the match, right? You have different pieces of potential controls here, but not every one of them is a perfect match. They must come from the same basket, right? So if I have other baskets, but this case I'm holding came from this particular basket, the controls must also come from that basket, right? In other words, the population that gave rise to the cases must be the same population that gives rise to the controls. Now, that is easier said than done. In very simple cases, very small, very narrowly defined cases, it's very easy. If, for example, you have a very small community and you have an outbreak of, let's say, food poisoning, we do a lot of food poisoning case control studies in outbreaks. And it's a small town, and you realize that, okay, everybody who went to this particular restaurant was individuals who got sick, or you found a bunch of cases. Let's say it's a hospital-based case control study. The question you're asking is, where would the people who are controls, right? Are there people who would have come to this hospital if they had also been sick, right? That is a litmus test you apply when trying to find controls, right? They have to come from the exact same population. Now, this is more of a hypothetical and a very philosophical concept for people to wrap their head around. Because, well, you're not finding them in a hospital, but we're saying that they are individuals who would or who could have come to that same hospital. So in the case of, for example, let's go back to the example we're talking about, oral cancer. I come to select cases from this hospital. And my question is, who are going to be my controls? My controls have to be people who would have come to that same hospital if they had been sick. Now, that gives me two options now. Option number one, I have to figure out the kind of hospital it is and who would have come to that hospital if they had been sick. Because then that means that I'm drawing my cases and my controls from the same population. So the options available to me would be to say, well, instead of thinking hypothetically about people who would have come to that same hospital if they had been sick, How about I just go ahead and select people who have come to that hospital now? And that's a viable option, right? Because now I have reduced my, the degrees of hypothetical thinking that I have to do. I already have people who are in that hospital at that moment. So that means that the people who come to that hospital, the challenge, however, is that you must remember that wherever you're selecting the controls must be in a way that is independent of exposure. So if I'm going to the oral surgery clinic to select people with oral cancer, the word I have to go to select controls must be one that is not associated with the exposure. In this case, smoking, right? For example, I might go to the OBGYN clinic and say, okay, well, I don't think there is a plausible relationship between going to an OBGYN clinic and smoking. Maybe not. So I'm going to safely go and select my controls from there. I might also say, I wonder whether the family medicine clinic attendance at that clinic can be theorized to be associated with smoking. I don't see any link just by thinking about it theoretically, but you have to think about it carefully and intentionally, right? Because in this case, you select controls from another ward of the same hospital in a manner that is independent of the exposure. Or you can select population controls if you don't want to select controls from a hospital, right? But remember that whatever you do, you have to put your thinking hat or thinking cap on and select individuals who would have come to the same hospital if they had been sick, right? So that is something you want to think about all the time, because that's a very common problem where you select controls in a manner that is not reflective of the source for the cases. Then you have underpowered studies. Studies are not underpowered. You don't calculate sample sizes adequately. You are too optimistic in your calculation of sample sizes. Perhaps you do not account for a proper ratio. And that's why we always encourage that you should use a ratio of at least 4, right? 4 controls to 1 case. Because it is not about the sample size you started with. That's not what matters so much. It is the effective sample size that you end up with. And remember, we said that if you end up with pairs that are concordant, they're not useful for the analysis because they're not contributing information in that match set. So it doesn't help us. If you end up with a set where there are only cases in that set but no controls, it doesn't matter that you have 1,000 of them. They're useless, right? So you can see how the effective sample size is dropping because of your design choices, right? So the most important thing here is the design. How are you designing your study? Are you overmatching? Are you ensuring that you account for the possibility of concordant pairs in the design? That's very important. So, and then the next problem is not accounting for the matching in the analysis. That introduces bias. It's not just enough to just match and say, oh, we matched cases to controls by age and sex, whatever, sure, that's great job. What happens in analysis? If you match without controlling for the matching, what you've done is you've done the worst thing ever in the world. You have introduced bias in the study. Remember that when we design studies, when we have, let me pull a. So when we design the study, we have the assumption of IID, right? That the rows are independent of each other. But in a case control study, obviously that assumption is false. If this is our data set and we have individual in row number, this is the case in row number 1, and we have a controls in row number 2. So let's say we've matched 3 controls to 1 case. So here we have these 4 rows, right? There are total of 4 rows here. Now, when we do a normal analysis from, for example, a random sample, what we are assuming is that each row is independent of the next row. Clearly, you can see that in the case control study, that assumption is false. These 4 rows are not independent. You match them based on whatever you match them on, age or sex or whatever. Clearly, they are very correlated. So if you match and you fail to account for the matching, it's serious error. You've introduced bias. So tomorrow's session will focus on how do you analyze data that came from a case control study in a way that accounts for the matching. That's business for tomorrow. We'll talk about that tomorrow and how to interpret the results. Today's business is not about that so much. We're just focused on the design today. All right, let's go back to our slides. All right, so that's a big problem. So if you, and I can't tell you how frequently enough that happens where people match. They match and then they tell you that, oh, we performed a regression analysis, a logistic regression analysis. It's like, okay, wrong. Or they match and they tell you the analysis they did does not tie up with what they said they did in the methods. If you said you matched, then I'm expecting some very specific methodology in your methods and specific results. If those two do not align, there is bias, and that's rejected because I'm rejecting that paper because it's very clear you don't know what you're doing, right? So this is a fatal error because it introduces bias into the study, and we want to be very mindful of that. So estimating prevalence from a case control study, that is also an absolute no, because remember that we select controls and match to cases in a very arbitrary manner. Study A, the individual could say, I'm going to match one control to the one case. In study 2, the person could say, well, in my study, I'm going to match 2 controls to the one case. Study 3 could say, I'm going to match 3 controls to one case. Study 4 could say 4. And then study 10, sure, it's rather inefficient, but it will say, I want to match 10 controls to one case. None of these guys are wrong. They're all correct because design of case control studies is both a science and an art. So there's no rule that says you must do it this way. But the problem, however, is that the prevalence you're going to get will change or will vary dramatically depending on the number of controls that were matched to a case. So for the exact same population, the only thing that's changing is the number of controls that have been matched to a case. You could get the prevalence of 10% here or 15%. The prevalence keeps jumping around, right? This is why we never, ever allow for prevalence estimates to be computed from case control studies because of the arbitrary nature of control selection. We select number of controls in a very arbitrary manner in a way that does not reflect the overall pattern of the population. For that reason, we don't use it for estimating prevalence. So these are some of the issues we want to really pay attention to. I think the most critical ones here are overmatching, because that has implications for precision, right? If you overmatch, your results may be valid, but they may be imprecise. Remember, precision is driven by sample size. Remember that. And remember what happens when you overmatch? You end up with cases that don't find a partner, and those are tossed out. Your sample size, meaning that your effective sample size is being dropped. Your data set may still be the same. You won't see any differences in your data set, obviously, since it's not as if we're throwing them out of the data set. They're there, but in the analysis, in the stratified analysis, they are being dropped, right? And so your confidence intervals become wider. This arose because you overmatched. So you can see how, it may not have a deleterious impact on validity, but it surely affects precision. And then this one where we say not accounting for the matching analysis, that has direct impact on validity. Your results are trash and should not be used for anything, right? That's a clear reject. So we're going to focus on that tomorrow and talk about how to conduct analysis properly when you have used a case control design. So how do you design a questionnaire for case control studies? There's some minimum sections that you must have. You must have a case control status variable. We're going to do this live now, so don't worry about trying to memorize it. So a variable or an indicator that indicates whether this is a case or a control. You must have a matching variable that indicates the cases and controls in a matched set. This variable should be dynamic, not fixed. It's dynamic because as you are entering more and more cases, then there should be a mechanism where you can select a particular case as being the ones you want to match your controls with. you want to ensure that you use a consistent format for easy identifiability. So for example, if my research is on authorship or retractions of manuscripts and papers, I can choose to have a format like author, journal, year. Again, if this sounds like Latin to you, we're going to look at the demo right now. And then it's always appropriate to have a section where you collect detailed information about cases. And you should do that in a manner that since it's affecting only cases, you don't have to be asking controls issues about cases. For example, back to the oral cancer issue we're talking about, you might want to collect more information about cases. Oh, when were you diagnosed with cancer and how long have you had symptoms and so on and so forth. Obviously, that has nothing to do with the control. So why are you asking them those questions? So just keep the controls from that section of the questionnaire. And then you collect all the exposure variables that you wish to analyze. So let's look at a case study now. So that we can think of how we can calculate sample size and create our proposal and create our questionnaire. So let's say that our case study is what factors are associated with journal retractions in the AI era. We're going to take this research question and we're going to think about the different ways we can design studies and see why we might choose to finally settle with a case control design. So that's what we're going to do now for our case study. But I want to pause and see if there are any questions from the lecture before we move on. Are there any burning questions? If there are no burning questions, you can keep them to the end. But if there are burning questions, you can quickly ask.
Kazim?
Good
Kazim?
evening from this side. Good evening from this side. Prof, thank you so much for your impact on us. Quickly, I want to ask a question. You made mention of, matching 4 controls with a case. I did not understand that area very well. I don't know if you can elaborate, explain it better. Sorry.
Okay.
I will appreciate, sir. Thank you.
Sure. So it means that it's like polygamy in some parts of the world where polygamy is allowed. For every man, you have 4 wives, for example, right? That's what polygamy means. So it's the same thing here. It's like saying for every case you find, you're going to have 4 controls and match them to that control based on the variables you have decided to. So it's like polygamy for your cases, if that makes any sense.
Sir, I want to really get it very clearly. I participated in a study here in Nigeria. I was a research assistant to one of my professors then. So we worked on dizygotic twinning. In this part of Nigeria, especially in Ibadan, there is a place that we call twins capital of the world, where they give birth to large population of dizygotic twinning. And I remember that the study was case control studies, where we selected our cases as we selected mothers with that gave birth to dizygotic twinning. Then our cases that we used then was the mother that gave birth to a singleton, like they gave birth to just a single child without any twins. So in that case, I'm confused. I don't understand. In that case, we have only one control and we have only one case. So it's getting confused. So that is why I asked that question, sir.
Okay. So in your case, right, let's say that you're interested in, you have a theory you want to test in this study. You're assuming that, let's say that your theory is that maybe these women are eating, there's this particular food they're eating that is associated with having twins, right? So you've selected your case, which is women that have twins. You've selected controls, which are women that do not have twins, right? So in this case, you've selected one control to one case. But remember, we said there's a problem here. There's something that will happen that you will not like. You might end up with concordant pairs. It's extremely risky to do one-to-one matching. Because imagine all the labor you went through to find a woman that had twins. Like you just told us that you had to go to a special place to find these people. Like what a shame it would be for you to come back and then realize in the analysis later on that, oh, geez, we have concordant pairs all over. Now, to avoid that, we are saying that in case control studies, we usually say recommend that you want to have up to 4 controls. In other words, for every woman who had twins, you want to select 4 women that did not have twins as the controls based on the matching factors you selected. So let's say you were selecting women based on the age. For every control, you wanted a woman that was maybe within the same age bracket. That was what you were matching on. So what we're saying is that you're going to select 4 of those women that have singletons and match to that one woman that had twins. So that's what we mean by matching 4 to 1 in this case. I hope that is clear.
Yes, I understand. Yeah, I understand. Because we actually use diets, we use age, and we use other factors, we use other variables to remember. Thank you. I think I got it. Yes.
Okay. And so the point we're saying also is that don't overmatch. Imagine you said we are going to match women based on what they eat and what they wear and their age and so many things. So you have found a case, but you will now struggle to find a control that matches that case. Now that becomes a problem for you. So that the moral of the story is do not overmatch. But I'm glad to get that now. All right. Next question.
Prof, how about we move forward and then you can take the questions at the end?
All right, that sounds good.
Hello.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right. Let's now look at our case study. Our case study now is saying we're interested in factors that are associated with journal retractions, right? So we're going to look at the different ways we could explore this exact same research question. So let's go to our study and let's set it up, right? So we're going to use the Chisquares platform to think through all these aspects of study design and questionnaire design and all of those things. So let me sign into my account and let us ideate on how we could go around that. So for those of you who are new, the Chisquares platform is a one-stop shop for everything that has to do with research. So you can design your studies, calculate sample size, and all of the stuff. Today, one of the things we want to use is to use the AI toolkits on the Chisquares platform to create a proposal. It's always a good idea to have a proposal for your study so that the more you put things down, the more you are going to be more intentional about how the study plays out, right? So don't just think and then go and execute. Don't just think and then go and design a questionnaire. You should always have a proposal, right? A proposal is not only for people who are writing masters or PhD or applying for a grant. Your study, even if it's just a personal study, you should have a protocol that you develop by yourself that forces you to think, right? So even if this study is just a personal project, we should still have a protocol for our study. So the AI toolkit is great because it allows you to sketch a protocol for your study and then flesh it out by yourself. So let's use the AI toolkit to then create a protocol for our study, which is focused on what factors are associated with journal retractions. I'm just going to copy this topic, and we're going to come here and you enter the title for your project. I'm just going to copy and paste that exact same title there, and I'm feeling rather lazy, so I'm just going to type the exact same things there. But you should absolutely type a bit more, nuance or more details there. Choose the study type. Now, one of the advantages of the toolkit here is that it allows you to write a proposal in a manner that is fit for that study design. If you don't know the design of a case control study, it becomes very hard for you to write a proposal or a protocol for a case control study because you don't even know what's supposed to be in that protocol. So that's the advantage of the AI toolkit as a mechanism for generating a protocol for you at the very beginning. The idea is not that you will take the output and just go and submit or do whatever. The idea is that you have a first draft which you can then ideate over. So here I'm going to select case control because that's the study design of interest now. Our main exposure is use of AI tools like ChatGPT. And our main outcome is retractions, journal retractions. That's what we're interested in. And choose the main research where the study will be conducted, and we'll select the United States. Research team, you put your name. I'm going to write my name here. And you select your qualification in terms of degrees, terminal degree or whichever. I'm just going to select a 1 degree here and role as the principal investigator. Here, and experience. I can just write, editor-in-chief of the. So here we're just asking for relevant experience. You can type whatever you want. Journal of Tobacco-Induced Diseases. I suck at typing so much these days. I dictate most of the time. So when I have to type, I struggle a lot. Okay. All right. So that's all you need. You provide the title, the idea. You can flesh out the idea a little bit, and you create a proposal. So the idea is that it's going to take the proposal that we have submitted, and it's going to create the idea we've submitted, and it's going to create a proposal for us, which we can then edit. So if the study design was a case control study, it's going to then formulate a protocol, an initial protocol that is aligned with that design and that contains all the minimum elements that should be in a design for that study type, right? So in this case, it's a case control study. So we're just going to wait a few seconds to minutes, see what it generates, so that we can then take it and look at different parts that should be in. So that when you are writing your own protocol for a case control study, then you know that these are the parts that should be in there. Or if it's your protocol, you can then flesh it out and edit it accordingly. Are there other questions? Maybe while it's generating.
Yes, Prof. Let me read one that was asked earlier. Someone's hand is up. Let me see. Dan. Okay, John, because your hand was up earlier. John?
Okay, thank you very much and good evening from Ghana. Prof, I'm very grateful. I'm an MPhil student at University of Ghana doing applied epidemiology, and to undertake a case control study, having cases to be severe malaria. And I was considering uncomplicated malaria as control. But one other suggestion from one of my supervisor was that why not having the control in levels where one will be uncomplicated malaria, whilst other being absence of malaria or diagnosed not malaria or negative for malaria. So I want to also match this by age group, then by facility. How do you see this, considering this level? Thank you.
What's the outcome again?
Complicated malaria or severe malaria. Severe malaria.
Okay. So the idea is that the individuals who you are selecting for controls obviously should be at risk for developing the outcome, right? So that's a clear way we want to think. So we don't want to, for example, take an individual who had severe malaria and select controls, for example, in the part of the world where they don't even have malaria, right? That doesn't make sense because those individuals were never at risk for developing that outcome. So in this case, you can have a scenario where the individuals indeed could be individuals who have like just normal malaria, which however you're defining normal malaria, right? And because then you can argue that they are indeed at risk for developing severe. So the question then becomes, The philosophical question then becomes, what really makes an individual progress from normal malaria, whatever you call it clinically, to that severe or complicated malaria, right? What exposures are different? So those indeed could be your controls. But the bottom line is that you want to make sure you select the controls in a manner that is independent of the exposure. Now, let's see how we calculate the sample size. We'll come back to this later when it's finished generating. For now, let's go and see how we can calculate sample size for and then we'll now take the other questions in line accordingly. So let's go to the sample size calculation for a case control study, and let's see how we can think about it. So here, when it comes to, sampling, sample size where we want to go to. We'll start new sample size calculation, and what we want to select is a comparative study with 2 arms. Comparative because a case control compares cases with controls. And we're going to select percentage as outcome because in our study, we're interested in what percentage of, retractions exist, when we compare the 2 arms. So comparative study with 2 arms, percentage as outcome. So you choose the study type, whether in this case, the default is case control, so that's great. Prevalence of outcome among the control group. So remember that in a case control, and this is a very important point, in a case control study, the outcome is the exposure. That sounds like a tongue twister and a paradox, but it's an extremely, extremely important point we want to establish. That in a case control study, the outcome is the exposure. In other words, let's go back to that oral cancer case we talked about. You have cases who are people diagnosed with cancer, oral cancer, and your controls that are people who are cancer-free. So obviously, they already have the outcome. So remember, in the case control, the outcome already exists, and we're going back in time to determine what the exposures were. So in other words, in this case, we're trying to say, what could be the exposure? Is it smoking? Is it exposure to this? Is it exposure to that? So in a case control study, the outcome of interest in the study is the exposure variable, right? So that's something we don't want to forget. So here, when it's saying prevalence of an outcome among control, remember in our study now, we're saying is ChatGPT use associated with retraction. The exposure of interest is ChatGPT usage, right? That is what the outcome is in our study. So please do not mix this up in a case control study. Remember that your outcome, when it says outcome in a case control study, it is referring to the exposure variable, in this case, use of ChatGPT. Because remember that a case control study is the reverse of a cohort study. So please, that is a very, very important point which we cannot forget. So here it's saying, what percentage of the control group, which is manuscripts that have not been retracted, what percentage of those do we think use ChatGPT? That's what it's asking. So we can say maybe 10%, perhaps. Once we have put that value, next is we have to provide one of the quantities here to indicate effect size. Effect size means the magnitude of a difference we wish to detect. In this case, between cases and controls. And the platform here gives you 4 options to choose to express the minimum difference you wish to detect. Here I could say, okay, let's use odds ratios. And I can say, at minimum, I want to detect an odds ratios of 1.5 between my cases and my controls. The smaller the effect you wish to detect, the larger the sample size will be. Think of a microscope. When we say a microscope is powerful, that means it can detect very tiny objects. And the tinier the object you wish to detect, the more powerful the microscope must be. So in other words, if we said, no, we don't want to detect 1.5, we want to detect 1.2, the object is becoming smaller and smaller and smaller, which means our microscope's power must become bigger and bigger and bigger. So you need to know the relationship between the effect size and the sample size. So here we're going to say we want to detect at least an odds ratio of 1.2 at level of confidence of 95, and the ratio of controls to cases, we're going to say 4. We've already discussed why we're doing that. And here, anticipated response rate. In this case, we are looking at manuscripts that have already been published. So the manuscripts are available to us already. So we're just going to put 100% as a response rate because there's no likelihood of rejection, of saying no, because we're extracting data from non-human sources. So here we're going to click on get results. And here the platform is saying that we need 65 cases, which in this case refer to retracted manuscripts. And we need 259 controls, which refers to manuscripts that were not retracted. And that means that for our study, we're going to need a total sample size of 324 manuscripts to be involved in this study. Remember that the question we're trying to explore was what factors are associated with journal retractions in the AI era, right? So cases are manuscripts that were retracted, controls were those that were not retracted. Now let's go back to our AI toolkit and let's see what it has. No, let's go to the history. So now this is the proposal it has created for us. It has given us a new title, AI and ChatGPT used in scientific manuscripts, a risk factor for retractions in the United States. It has written a background for us and put references. These references are not AI derived. What happens is that as the platform writes, right, as the AI writes, it looks for references in PubMed and other scientific sources, which are also provided at the bottom. So if you search for any of these references, you will see them in PubMed. They're actual living references. But bottom line, let's look at how a case control proposal or protocol should be structured. You have a background, you have the research questions and aims. Here, the aim one is to quantify the relationship between AI and ChatGPT use in scientific manuscripts and the occurrence of retractions in the United States, which was our target population. And so it has provided the hypothesis that the odds of reporting AI and ChatGPT use will be higher among cases with retractions compared to controls without retractions. Please take note of how we report. Of course, tomorrow we're going to focus on the analysis and interpretation, but look at how, pay careful attention to how it phrases the hypothesis in a way that is very unique for case control studies. We're saying that the odds of reporting the exposure, which is AI and ChatGPT use, will be higher among cases, right? If it were a cohort study, we would have said that the odds of reporting retractions will be higher among exposed compared to the non-exposed. In the case control, the language is always flipped, all right? So again, this is one of the advantages of the AI toolkit here. It helps you provide things in the right template, the right language. Your job then is to now take it and then update it and make changes to suit your use case. But this is the hypothesis here, that the odds of reporting AI and ChatGPT use will be higher among cases with retractions compared to controls, which are the manuscripts without retractions. And so it provides significance, the innovation, the approach. It talks about the selection of cases, that cases will be ascertained through a comprehensive search of multiple sources, including databases like Retraction Watch and PubMed. And so that is how cases will be selected. Then you have selection of controls. You must provide in a protocol for a case control study, you need to address each of those elements. How are we going to select cases? How are we going to select controls? Where are we going to find the cases? All of those things must be addressed. How are we going to determine exposure, right? Again, a key element of a protocol for a case control study. How are we going to assess the outcome? How are we going to perform analysis? Strengths and challenges. So the protocol for a case control study is obviously, as you can imagine, very different from what you would write for a survey, right? Because it has very unique elements that must be addressed in the design. So again, you should definitely play with the AI toolkit and see how you could, especially if you're working with a case control study, to make sure that what you are developing makes sense and it's fit for use. Now, let's go back to the questionnaire, because one of our objectives was also to see how we can generate questionnaires. How are questionnaires for case control studies different from those for just regular studies? And let's go back here. These are the 4 elements we mentioned. You must have a case or control status variable. You must have a matching variable that is dynamic and not fixed. You should ensure a consistent format for identifiability. And let's see how all of this plays out. So again, our research question is the relationship between ChatGPT usage and what do you call it? And refraction. So let's create a manuscript here, a questionnaire here to see how we can incorporate all of these elements for a case control study. So on the Chisquares platform, we're going to come to the survey design and we'll click on Start New Survey and we'll click on Continue. This is just a standard survey, so we're going to start and provide our title here as assessment of factors associated with retractions. In the United States. So that's our research question. The data location is United States. That is optional. You don't have to provide that, but if you do, you can always type that. The project aims, we can ask AI to generate an aim for us or aims for us by simply clicking this button there. So the system takes the context and generates aims with AI. Or you can just type them yourself, whichever works for you. All right, so here I'm just going to select the first 2 aims that were suggested by AI and add them. The keywords, you can also ask AI to generate keywords for you. And I can select that and add them. And then here it says select all that apply to your study, whether it the kind of data to be collected and study population. In this case, our study population is we're not studying humans, we're studying manuscripts. So none of this applies to our study. So I'm just going to skip all of those and create survey. So now our questionnaire has been created. So now we can create questions. So let us now go ahead and create some of the questions for our hypothetical use case and see some of the very unique things that must be present when we're designing the questionnaire for a case control study. So first, we want to add general questions that apply to everyone. So let's go back. Let's match those things here. Before case control status variable, let's just ask questions that involve all the papers, like the name of the author, the name of the year it was published, and so on, because those are background information that applies to all of the manuscripts. So let's choose a question source, and we're going to create a new question. And we will use a open-ended question here and say, what year was the manuscript published? Or just simply year of publication. So when you type questions or STEM, one of the things you must provide on the Chisquares platform is the label. The label is what later on becomes the variable name. The platform attempts to provide one for you, but you can either use AI to suggest another option, or you can just type in yourself. So here, I can just say publication year. And here, I can now put the options I want. In this case, I can choose to have text, number, email, or phone number. Obviously, the ones that apply here, the best will be text or number. I prefer text because it's easier to manipulate text. For example, I can configure input. When you're setting up data, any kind of data, it is your job as a researcher to make sure that you prevent bad data from being input. If somebody enters, like you ask for year of publication and somebody enters a value like let's say 01, like what does 01 mean? Is it 2021? It makes no sense. So it's your job to impose requirements on data collection. So here, for example, I will use text and I'll configure the input, which is simply saying that I want to control what the user is allowed to enter. I can say I want minimum number of characters, 4, because a year can only have 4 characters. 1981, 1972, 2001. Maximum number of characters also is 4. So 4 minimum, 4 maximum. So you cannot put 21. It has to be 4 characters. I also want to make sure that I want to customize survey inputs by adding other requirements to the data collection. So once I do that, I can say, here are the rules that I have. There are 3 options here. I can choose to use predefined entities. That does not apply here. I can choose to use custom regex, regular expressions, special instructions to the computer. We don't have to use that now. But here, I want to allow special characters. I want to impose a limit on the type of characters that should be allowed. I have allowed only 4 maximum characters at, minimum and maximum. So, for example, 1924, 1924, or 1996. But I only want them to be numbers only. So I can come here and say, allow only numbers. So these are the allowed characters that I want to say. Just if it's this character that I selected, allow it. If it's not, don't allow it. So now the system will then enforce it such that if you came and wanted to type ABCD, that's not a number, so it will reject it. Because you want to make sure you don't spend time later on cleaning data, right? Every act of data cleaning for primary data collection is a failure to impose constraints for bad data, right? So make sure you put those safeguards before, not after data collection. So we have done that. Now we can push to questionnaire. So we have one question now. Now let's add another question that indicates case control status. Is this a case or is this a control? That is an extremely important variable, as you can imagine. So let's add that here. Case or control status. So let's just add a single response question type and say, is this a case or control? You don't have to use those exact terms. Is it a retracted or non-retracted manuscript? But it's just easier to call it case and control so you can remember clearly. So here I can call it case status, and the options will be case or control. Please don't design a case control without adding this variable. So case and control. So now we have case control status. So that's what is here now. Now we might want to add other variables that are unique to cases. For example, if it's our original analogy for oral cancer, how long have you been having symptoms and how long have you been? Those are things that don't affect the controls, but have to do with the case. But we want to collect all that information. In this case, we're talking about retraction. So we can ask questions like, when was this retracted? And what was the rationale or the reason for retraction? So let's add just one of that kind of question as a representative member. So we can add a question like an open-ended question, or date time response that says, when was this paper retracted? Because it's possible that you might be interested in not just the year, but the month and the year. You might argue that there's some seasonality in retraction rates. So in those kind of date scenarios, you don't want to capture only the year, but you want to provide, fuller capture of time, including day, month, and year. It's always better to collect as much information as you can on the particular variable, and then you can parse it into the component parts later on. When was this paper retracted? So here we can say we want only date only, such that this is the preview that tells you how the user will see the question and engage with it. So you can always see the preview where they can select the dates, the exact dates that occurred, if you are interested in exact dates, obviously. So We can call this retraction or retract date. And so you can configure input also to say, for every question type, you have options where you can control the data allowed. So here, for example, you can specify whether dates should be in the month, day, year format, or any of the other formats. You can set limits for dates. So you can say the start date should be from this date, and the end date obviously cannot be a future date, obviously. So you can set all of those limits as you desire. And once you are happy with it, you can then push the questionnaire. Now, let's look at the next item that we really need to capture. The next one is the unique ID for the cases. This is very important. The ID for the cases. For each case, remember in the case control study, the cases are the ones that are in the driver's seat. When we find a case, we then match a control to that case. So there has to be a way we can identify that case, right? So you need to have another variable in your questionnaire that is an identifier for cases, a unique identifier for cases, so that you provide a consistent format. So for example, in this case, we can say, we want an identifier that allows us to just at a glance know that this is a case. And we can say it's going to be the author, the journal, and the year. Maybe because we're matching on the journal and we're matching on year. So in our manuscript, we have decided that we're just going to match on two factors: the year it was published and the journal in which it was published. So if a paper was published in this journal, it may not even have to be a particular journal. It could be a family of journals. So if the paper was a tobacco journal or tobacco manuscript, we're going to search for, a control among the tobacco control journals, not necessarily a very specific journal like the Journal of Tobacco-Induced Diseases. Those are design decisions that you have to make as the investigator. So, but regardless of the case, you must have an indicator, a matching variable that says, this is the ID of the case, and we're going to be matching individuals to the case by selecting that one. So let's indicate the unique ID for the case first. Let's come here, open-ended questions. Obviously, it has to be open-ended. It has to be a question that you can type in the unique ID that you want for each case. So let's select single value response question type. And let's say, please enter or unique ID of case. Extremely important. Please do not create a questionnaire for a case control study without having such controls. Because remember, each case must be uniquely identified. That is the only way where you can then select for each control and match them to that case, right? So unique ID of case, let's call this a case ID. It has to be text, obviously, but we want to make sure that you create in such a way that, one, you can easily identify a particular case based on the pattern you have selected. In this case, for example, we have said we're going to use this format: author, journal, year. So that just by looking at the ID, so for example, Agaku, TID, or tobacco-induced disease, 2023, this tells me that this was written by this author, and this is the journal, and this is the year. You can come up with whatever format you want. This is not a rule, obviously, but it should make sense to you. You should be able to recognize immediately just by looking at it that, okay, this is, or you can also, if you're interested in matching on country, then it can be, let's say, instead of the name of the author, which you don't care so much about, you can put the country. For example, the paper published in Nigeria in the Journal of Tobacco-Induced Diseases in 2023. Maybe that's the unique ID for that particular manuscript or case, right? So you have that in such a way that it's easily identifiable, right? But that is what we're trying to do now. So case ID, we want it to be text so that we can control it. It is extremely important that you impose constraints on this because this is the variable ultimately that will be analyzed. This is what will form the matching variable that we'll be analyzing later on. So you can't call it this, and these two things are different, right? Because here you have a space there all of a sudden, right? Or let's remove this underscore entirely. These are not the same thing. So as far as the software is, whatever software you're using, these are completely different things. This is one case where you don't want to use manual efforts, where you are doing things manually. No. In case control design, any manual attempt or manual manipulation of things will cause a lot of error because unless you have to go back later and start cleaning things. And some of those things could be so tiny that you may not be able to even know that there's a space there, right? So it has to be automated. And these are some of the things that have been addressed on the Chisquares platform, right? So here we provide case ID and we're going to configure the inputs. We're going to say we want a minimum of, let's say, 5 characters. Maybe there's no maximum. And we want to customize the inputs by allowing certain special characters. We want to allow letters. The special ID can contain letters, maybe can contain numbers. We don't want currency symbols. We don't want percentage. We don't want all of those things. So the system will not allow them. We definitely don't want spaces. Try to avoid spaces in anything that is a unique ID. Whenever there's a space, it is extremely hard for the naked eye to tell that there's a space, right? And you can have a space at the beginning that you're not even aware that exists, right? So whatever you do, if for anything that is unique ID, please do not include spaces. And please do not include special characters, except, if you will, an underscore. If you allow both a dash and an underscore, sometimes it becomes very hard to tell the difference between a dash and an underscore. So try to restrict the numbers of or the types of unique IDs that you are allowing for special IDs like the case ID, because it could throw a lot of mistakes and could ultimately affect your analysis if you're not careful. So here, I'm just going to select allow letters, allow numbers, and allow, let's say, an underscore. I love underscores because they allow you to make a visual distinction between items. So if there are no underscore here, it becomes very hard to tell this name separate from this. But an underscore makes all the difference in the world, right? So we're going to allow those ones. So here we've allowed A to Z, lowercase, A to Z, uppercase, and 0 to 9. So that is great. So we can then apply it. So we've said the minimum number of characters is 5. Because we're allowing it should be more than 5 because we have 4 characters in in the year and at least the rest. So, but anyway, you get the point. You can say 10 or whatever, but this is just to impose constraints on your data collection. And then we apply. So that's our unique case ID. And then we can now push the questionnaire. All right, so let's see what we have done so far. We have added a case control status variable. Lungile, are you the one requesting for access to the computer?
No, Prof.
Okay, so I should decline. All right.
Yes, please.
All right. I'm still traumatized from the last event. All right, so what was I saying? All right, so so we've created a case ID. So we've created a case control status variable, whether you're a case or a control. That's number 1, extremely important. We have created a unique ID. Okay, these requests are proliferating quite rapidly. We've created a measure for the unique ID for the cases, right? For each case, we have a unique case ID. We don't have a control ID because that is not needed. Remember that in the case control study, the cases are the ones in the driver's seat, right? It is their car. So when you enter their car, you have to obey their rules. So that's why we have created a case ID, but not a control ID, because the controls will simply be matched to the cases, right? That's why we're doing it that way. Now, we have to now create a matching variable that will allow us to select which controls belong to a particular case. So let's create a drop-down menu question that will then say, please select which case this control is to be matched to, right? So you have because remember that we have our data set, we have rows, rows, rows. There needs to be a way where we can link each control to a case. And remember we said then that this must be dynamic. So in other words, we don't know upfront the cases we have. So the list must be a dynamic list, right? So let's come back and create that from here. So we're going to call this our matching variable. And this matching variable will form the basis for our analysis tomorrow. So when we're analyzing case control studies, you will see that we're going to account for clustering. That clustering comes from this question we're creating now. So when you are designing your study, you have to account for all of these things. All of these variables must be present when you're creating your questions. Now, how do we want to account for this? We don't want to use user-supplied entries. No, that's not the right option. We want to use dynamic responses from another question, right? So we're going to select dynamic options. Select that. And the dynamic response we want to select is the unique ID of case. So in other words, as the cases have been entered with their unique IDs, for example, this one here, when we come to a particular control, we're saying, oh, yes, this is the case that we want to match this control to. That's what it's saying in simple language, right? And again, please, you can only understand these things after class. You know, the real learning occurs after class. Not the class is just to give you pointers. So you have to practice and practice. All right, so select the single value question to pipe answers from. So we're going to select case ID. So as the cases have been entered, we're going to select the controls to match the case. Obviously, as should be very obvious, the case, you must do a case first before you select its control. Remember we said that the controls are in the car of the cases. Well, that means the car has to be there first. If the car is not there, what are you entering into? So the case goes first, and then the controls for that case come next. So here we have selected the case that each control is matched to, and we have used dynamic selection to say we are going to use that list from the other question to supply, and that will form what we are going to use for our question in this case, right? So this is dynamic, so that as we collect more and more controls, more and more cases, that drop-down menu will be growing longer and longer, and we can select whichever case that we want to assign as being the match for the control in question, right? Those are, at minimum, things that if you are doing a case control study, things that you should be able to comfortably set up. If you don't collect data on those variables, that means that you have doomed your analysis already. There's no way we can know that these individuals, remember we said this picture here, rows number 2, 3, and 4 are all matched to individual number 1, row number 1. But how are we to know that this is a match pair, right? Because you can have the next guy, the next here, and you have the next set of, these are part of a set, and this is another part of another set of 4, right? So there has to be a unique ID that says this is A set, these are all linked to set A, and these are all linked to set B, right? Without this, you have doomed your study for failure. We cannot analyze that data. It is this variable here that allows us to recognize that these guys are part of this set, and the next guys are part of this set, right? And that is what you do when you select which case that the control is being matched to. The system can then say, okay, so that when you're analyzing your data, we're going to ask you for this variable. And if you don't have the variable, then your analysis are going to be wrong and invalid, right? So that's how you set up the data collection for a case control study. You can always add your logic. Mao said it's great to add logic because we have questions here that the controls have no business over. So when you look at our skip patterns, let's add a skip pattern. Let's add new logic. And we're going to use this question as a trigger. Is this a case or a control? If they're a control, then there's no business asking them, when was this paper retracted? Because it is not a retracted paper. There's no business asking them for unique ID of case because it's not a case. So that means that if you're a control, the next question you should be seeing should be this one. So we're going to select this question here and say if the value of case control is exactly equal to control, then route participants to this question. They don't have to see the question on when was it retracted. Why are you showing them that? It is not relevant. So, and we submit. And that's how you set up logic for a case control study. So that the controls, you skip them over the questions that are not relevant to them. If your study is a study involving human subjects, obviously you want to add consent, informed consent, to let people know what the study is all about. You can come to informed consent here. Right now we don't have an informed consent form. We can just add the form and add a title like informed consent and generate a default and submit. So that when we are previewing our study, we're going to have that, that as part of our consent there, and we can then start our questionnaire, the year of publication, and so on and so forth. As users take the information, then you can then have it in your data set so that you don't have to do any manual manipulation or the cleaning of the data afterwards. So it's very important that you set up the data collection in a way that prevents or even eliminates any need to clean up data, right? The way you do that is through automation and through logic. You build intelligence into your survey so that some of those errors are eliminated right from the word go. And you make sure absolutely that you collect some of the key information that we need, especially the matching variable and the variable that indicates whether it's a case or a control. Because if you didn't collect that, how are we supposed to analyze data? It means all your analyses are invalid. So tomorrow we're going to focus on the analysis. But I want to stop here. I think so that we can accommodate questions. I saw quite a lot of hands raised, so we have adequate time to answer the questions. So any questions, please?
Thank you, Prof. Before we get to question, I just want to announce that we will now post the attendance link. Please complete it, provide all your details, your name and email address at the end of the survey. It's an evaluation survey for those who are joining us for the first time, but it's also our attendance register. So please ensure that your name is correctly written and submitted so that you can get your certificate by the end of next week. Thank you. So moving to questions. Let me first read some questions that were posted much earlier on. For the ratio of 4:1 of control versus cases, will that ratio 4:1 reflect in the sample size calculation? Thanks.
Yeah, I think that question should have been answered by our calculation. Yes, when we're calculating our sample size, we accounted for that. If you remember, we said our study is comparative with 2 arms. And when we selected controls, when we came to ratio of controls to cases, we selected 4. We said 4 controls to each case, and that was accounted automatically in the sample size calculation. But remember that the big picture is that we are trying to avoid a scenario where we end up with cases that have no controls or cases and controls that are concordant pairs. You don't want that, obviously. So that's why we're doing that. So just keeping in mind the big picture of why we're doing certain things.
Thank you, Prof. And sorry, just to announce once again, please don't share your email addresses on the chat box. We are sharing an attendance link. So it's a survey. I've posted it again just now. Please check the chat box. That's where you complete the information, you fill in your details. Please don't share your email addresses here. Thank you. Okay, so the next question, Prof. How do you calculate sample size in case control studies? Thought case control is for rare diseases.
Yes, for rare diseases. That's why you start with the cases and the sample sizes as demonstrated.
So would a cross-sectional study be more ideal for evaluating prevalence?
Yes, you can have a representative sample and derive prevalence estimates from that. Yes, from a cross-sectional study. Yes.
Thank you. Can you select controls from the community in hospitalized cases? If yes, will the study be hospital-based or community-based?
You can select controls. You just need to remember the philosophical basis for selection of controls. Controls must come from the same population that gave rise to the cases. If you're selecting cases from a hospital, then they should be individuals who would have gone to the same hospital if they had been sick. So in our heads, philosophically at least, they are there in the hospital. Even if not physically, we imagine them going to the hospital if they had been sick, right? So we can select controls from individuals who are, in other words, the same hospital, or we can put on our philosophical hat and say, of these people who would have gone to the hospital, that same hospital, if they had been sick. We can use their siblings, for example. If they are siblings, then we might imagine that they will have gone to the same hospital. However, you want to make sure that the exposure is not something that is shared by among siblings, right? Because if both siblings are most likely to share the exposure, then you end up in hot soup. So yeah, but understand the philosophical basis for which we make certain decisions, and then you don't need to worry about some technical nuances, because then it becomes very clear to you at every point what needs to be done.
Thank you. So what will you advise should be the standard ratio of control versus cases?
There's no rule of thumb. It depends on context. It depends on your understanding of the condition, and so there's no rule of thumb. But if you want a rule of thumb, then use 4 controls to 1 case.
Thanks. Can the software generate protocols for all types of studies?
Yes, most
That's
of
the
them.
Chisquares platform.
That's correct. Yes.
Please, for non-clinical research, how do I know the best research method to use? For instance, a map study among a group using Questionnaire.
For example, can you repeat that example, please? The last
A
part.
map study among a group using a Questionnaire.
A map study. Well, you'll have to go and do a little more research on the study you're trying to, and what the objectives are. Remember that the dog must wag the tail. The tail should never wag the dog, right? Meaning that the research objectives drive our methodology and everything else. So you have to establish what it is you want to achieve from a study first. So it's not a matter of saying, oh, here's a study design that we just apply randomly. The objectives will drive the design, but there's no epidemiologic study called a map study. So once we understand your objectives clearly, then it's easier to then design an appropriate study that is fit for use and fit for purpose.
Thank you. What is the major difference between case control and retrospective cohort study?
So the major difference is, where's my slide deck?
Oh, Prof, sorry. They say they meant to ask about KAP study?
KAP. So KAP study, or knowledge attitudes and practices, it's not a study design. It's just a title. A KAP study, most commonly people use that in relation to a cross-sectional study, but it is not a study design. So you can use it for, it's best suited for things that are exploratory or things that are new. But yeah, if you are advancing your career, I would say you want to think of more robust designs like analytical studies, because at some point you want to do things that are more robust and at par with your current level of academic standing. So KP is useful, but that's what you would perhaps expect from research that is addressing like brand new issues that have just came out, or for more younger researchers. But bottom line is that KP is not a kind of study design. It's just a title of the paper.
Thank you. Let me see if there are any hands. Okay. Benedict. Benedict?
Yes, I am here. Well, Prof, that's a wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed every bit of it. My name is Paul Benedict, a PhD student at the University of Jos, Nigeria. So I'm actually working on a project. My project topic is basically on dengue fever virus and malaria parasite co-infection in both febrile and non-febrile patient. So I don't know what study design. Should it be a case control study or should be a cross-sectional study? Thank you.
Any question you have in this world can be answered with any design. The question we looked at here, our case study, we could decide to answer this with a cross-sectional study. We could have done a case series where we look at all the retractions. So a case series in this case is we took all the retracted papers, and our data set is only made up of retracted papers. And we're trying to look at, of these retracted manuscripts, what percentage came from the social sciences and what percentage came from the health sciences. That's a case series, because everybody there in that data set is made up of individuals or manuscripts defined by the same outcome. We could have done a cross-sectional study where we just write a script that goes to PubMed API and grabs a whole bunch of manuscripts, both as retracted and non-retracted, and we explore. We could have done a case control study like we did now. We could have done a cohort study where we start with manuscripts at the beginning that were just written with or without AI, and we follow them to see 10 years from now which ones are retracted. We could have done an experiment where we randomize investigators to use AI or not to use AI, and we'll follow them over time to see which ones are more likely to be retracted. We could have done any of those things. So the moral of the story, I guess, in a nutshell, is that there is no perfect study design. You, as an investigator, you choose what to do. All right. So that's why you need to know the nuances, and you need to know what you really want to achieve and how you want to communicate it. You need to know your budget, because the different study designs come with different budgets and logistical needs. So it's almost impossible to look at a topic and say, this is what you should do. Unfortunately, that is your decision as the investigator to say, this is what I want to do, and this is why I want to do it.
Okay. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Prof. When we select controls, it should be possibility of exposure and independent of exposure. What does it mean?
So when we're selecting controls, we're saying that you want to select them independent of exposure, right? So in other words, put your hand into the jar and just remove one. Don't look at the color, right? If I'm trying to remove, if I'm trying to remove, if I have a bunch of, let's say, balls in the jar, and I want to select them independent of their color, the wrong way to do it is to peep into the jar and say, I like the red one. I'm going to pick the red one. Or the wrong way would be to say, oh, I know that that side is full of the red ball, so I'm going to stretch out there and remove the red ball there. No. The right way will be to shake that ball, that jar, and just put my hand without looking and just pick any ball. That means that I'm selecting independent of the color, right? It's the exact same thing. When you're selecting independent of exposure, we're not looking for people who are exposed, nor are we looking for people who are unexposed. We're trying to make it as random as possible, the selection of controls in relation to the exposure status, right? So we don't want to go to where people who have the exposure are residing and say, because then that means that we're selecting people who are looking more and more like the cases. Because remember, the last thing you want is something like this, where you have the cases and the controls looking so like each other. In this case here, right, I should have done you know what I should have done? Let's change this illustration quickly. So this is what we have here. This is what we should have. So here we have a scenario like this. And then so here in this case, the shape represents whether it's case or control. In this case, the cycles are the cases and the squares are the controls. And the color is the exposure, right? When you're selecting your controls in a way that is not independent of the exposure, well, you now have a scenario where the squares, which are the controls, begin to look like the controls. Let's look at this in a practical way. Let's go back to our case study so that we'll make it more practical. Our case study is saying that we want to look at the association between ChatGPT usage and retractions, right? So we select manuscripts that are retracted from Retraction Watch. That's where we select cases from Retraction Watch. It's a website that has all the papers that are retracted. Now, the question is, where should we select controls? Option number one, we can go to one very sketchy journal, right? Like, I don't want to mention names, but we can go to a very sketchy publisher and say, oh, we're going to select controls there. But that is a very bad practice, because now we're selecting controls in a way that is related to the exposure. It's a sketchy journal, so what do you expect? You expect that people who are submitting their papers there will have very sketchy manuscripts that were written without consideration for AI ethics, right? So in papers published in that outlet are going to be very similar to, even though they're not retracted yet, they are very similar in exposure profile to papers that have actually been retracted, right? So going to that sketchy outlet is not the right place to go and select controls. We should select controls in a neutral manner. That's what we're saying. So we should go to PubMed and just select for good or for bad in terms of the exposure status, right? That's how you select independent of the exposure. So you don't want to go to a sketchy journal to select, nor do you want to go to the New England Journal, which is the best journal in the world, where you're going to have very little retractions. No, you want to go to a place that's neutral, whether for good or for bad. That is what we mean independent of exposure. I hope that makes sense. All right, any other questions?
Thank you, Prof. Yes, of course. Can the platform be used to interpret the nanochemistry results and discuss it?
If your results are in the form of a data set, yes, you can analyze the platform and the platform you can analyze data accordingly quantitatively. So if that's the case, yes, but you will have to give the meaning live. But platform supports all quantitative data analysis on it.
Thank you. David?
Hello. Good evening, Prof.
Hello.
Yeah, good evening. Please, I was the person that asked the question about where to get, if you're to use controls for hospital cases, if you're to use them from whether from the hospital or from the community. Now, if you get the controls from the community I'm from a community health background, and there's this dogma that if you're to do your dissertation, whether MSc or MPH, that it has to be a community-based study. So if your cases, my interest is in snakebite cases. So obviously you get your cases, snakebite cases in a hospital. There's a treatment center for snakebite. So that's where you get your cases. But the factors responsible for that exposure are usually within the community. So you're going to get your controls from the community. So how would you now describe, does it make it a community-based study, or is it a hospital-based study?
So what's the research question then? Like people,
The risk factors for snakebite.
Okay, in that case, that may not necessarily be so. You could look at one of multiple ways, right? You're selecting individuals who were, let's say, in the hospital you have individuals who were taken to the hospital for treatment of snake bites. So your question is, how is this population different from individuals who were not? So you can select individuals from controls, right? But the point is that it has to be the same source population that gave rise to those cases. Imagine two populations, right? Population A, which is full of snakes. Population B has no snakes. And then we have a hospital where you have guys with snake bites. You imagine you went and selected from population A where there are no snakes at all. Remember that the controls must be people who are at risk for the outcome. But there are no snakes there at all. So that's why we always insist that the individuals who you're selecting as controls should be people who have a similar profile. They should be people who would have gone to the same hospital had they been been bitten by a snake. So because it's also possible that community A has snakes, but those guys go to another hospital when they receive snake bites, right? So it's your job at that point then to say, where are these cases coming from? That's where you start. I have a whole bunch of cases, but that's only half of the equation. Where do these cases come from? What is the source of the cases? It is only by answering that question that we can then select appropriate controls for those cases. I don't know, does that answer your question? So yes, you can select from a community.
Not really, sir. The question is, the entire area is endemic for snakebite. The idea is, if there's a case of snakebite, we will go back to the community, to the location of that particular case, to the community, and get his controls from that community.
Okay.
So all the cases are, so the area is endemic, and people coming from outside the area are not going to be included. They are not going to be included as cases.
Okay.
So you go back to the geographical location for each case, you go back to the geographical location where he was beaten, his community, and select his controls.
That makes sense. So in this case, you might want to match on time, because you can argue that there's some seasonality to snake bites, right? Yes. So you for people who were at that point in time, who were living in that community at that point, and that same community. So that way, that's an excellent way of doing it too.
So, but the question now is, does the study, is it a hospital-based case control or a community-based case control study?
So you can call it community-based, since you are selecting controls. You are going back to the community, matching all the community and selecting from there. So you can call it community-based control. But in general, I wouldn't worry too much about what issues of semantics, right? As far as you are designing the study in a way that makes sense, and you make sure that there's some degree of exchangeability between the two groups you are studying, that would be the most important thing. But in your use case, yes, that would qualify as community-based.
Thank you very much, sir.
You're welcome. Yeah.
Nice. Google. KOKO. All right. Victor.
Yes, good evening. Thank you. Sorry, I apologize. I joined late. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you very well.
Hello.
Victor.
Yes, sorry, apologies. I joined late, and I think the last bits I picked is interesting. My question is on if I'm doing a study on drug resistant TB cases. I'm calling from Uganda. I'm in the Karamoja region. If I'm doing a study on drug resistant tuberculosis, and I want to do the case control, there are some factors. I have understood you have to look at the population, but are there other factors I have to consider when I am matching my cases in this region? And if they are there, I would love to know them. Then, secondly, is there any appropriate matching that I should use when I'm doing this case control?
So
For
the
this is
first thing is to determine whether or not you need the case control in the first place. Now, assuming that you've decided that yes, you want to go case control, again, you must remember that the controls must be people who are at risk for developing the outcome of interest, right? So in this case, it might be that individuals who have tuberculosis are controls, but who do not have drug-resistant tuberculosis. There's a difference, right? So the philosophical question then becomes, how are these two groups different in their exposures? Individuals with drug-resistant tuberculosis versus those who do not have drug-resistant tuberculosis. You should match. I'm assuming that you don't have like 1 million tuberculosis people. That's a very niche population. So you want to make sure you match in just enough ways that you'll be able to reduce confounding, but not overmatch. One of the things we discussed before you probably came was overmatching. So you might benefit from going back and reviewing the lecture videos to see what we discussed about overmatching, but you want to make sure that you avoid that. Okay, any other questions? Coco.
Yeah, good evening, Prof. I don't know whether I'm audible now.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you for this insightful lecture. I am new to this area. This is not my primary area, but I've been following your teaching. And I want to try out research that involves part of this training. I'm guiding a master's student, and the question actually is, we want to do a twin study. First, a cross-sectional study that will involve geriatric patients at a teaching hospital here in Nigeria, and use of smokeless tobacco, that is snuff, and follow it up with what I consider now, if it falls into a case control, we now want to go into their folder after the survey, so that the people who used the tobacco, smokeless tobacco, will now be the case, and people who attend the same clinic, but they did not use the smokeless tobacco, will now become the control. I don't know whether it is ideal.
Okay, I think that would be, I think you might be forcing a square peg into a round hole. I think that in your use case, a case control study might not be appropriate or necessary at all. I think that in your use case, you should just stick with a cross-sectional study and just say, what are the factors associated with smokeless tobacco use, right? So you can then say, look at things like age and gender and race, or other factors that are relevant. But in this case, a case control study may not necessarily be relevant, because we use case control studies more for outcomes, like clinical outcomes. Like it's more fitting for, like in the use case you're describing, things that are rare. Smokeless tobacco in certain regions may not necessarily be a very rare event. It may be quite a common event. So I think that is the juice may not be worth the squeeze. You might be doing so much for so little in return. So this use case, I would say just stick with the survey and you'll be fine.
Okay. Then it's okay because our interest actually had been to, anyway, when we are talking about following up, we wanted to also look at the diseases that we are presenting at above 60 years. That was our interest.
Okay. So it would be best for you to have a very well-defined hypothesis and say, I want to look at, for example, cancer of the mouth, right? I believe individuals who have cancer of the mouth might have higher rates of smokeless tobacco use. See, that's a very well-defined hypothesis where I am hypothesizing that smokeless tobacco use is associated with lip cancer or, oral cancer, right? And in that case, that is a very well-suited study for a case control study. Why? Because oral cancer is rare, because it is very, very well defined and it can easily identify controls. And then the thing I'm trying to see now is smokeless tobacco, associated with this or not? So smokeless tobacco and other behaviors then become the outcomes in my case control study. Because remember, in the case control study, the outcome is exposure, right? The outcome of interest is exposures like smokeless tobacco and other things. So that will be a more fitting study for a case control study than the original proposition.
Okay, sir. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome.
Desalegn?
Thank you, Prof. I really enjoy its case control study. So far, I have published 2 papers on case control study. But I do have one question. What is we know that case control study is used for rare disease. What will be the minimum sample size for cases? Is there any rule? I don't know.
You have to calculate it. That's what we did now. So you have to go to the Chisquares platform and calculate it. So the rule of thumb is that there's no rule of thumb. So you have to calculate it for your use case.
What I mean is, for example, like that the GPS in our setup is very small, 10 up to 20 cases. Can we carry out a case control study?
So you will have to go and calculate the sample size that you need first. And then after calculating the sample size, you might realize that, oh, my sample size calculation shows that I need 50 cases. Well, if you have 20 cases, that means 20 is not the same as 50. That means that your study is not powered adequately. And if you go ahead with the study, you might end up saying that there was no difference between cases and controls, but that is not true. That is a type 2 error. You fail to detect a signal, even though a signal exists, just because the study was unpowered. So the answer will always be go and calculate the sample size first.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. I think we've answered.
I missed any questions. Yeah, what do we have? If there are any other questions, you can quickly post them. Yeah, but it looks like we've answered all the questions. How do I calculate sample size? This was addressed earlier. David, please watch the recording. Concept. Okay. David and then Napo.
Hello?
Yes.
Good evening once again, Prof. The question about sample size calculation, when we do, it just came up. I've earlier asked you a question. When we go out for outbreak response, I'm an FETP graduate. You don't know the number of cases for like cholera that the cholera cases you're going to get. You calculate a minimum sample size, then you wait for cases to come. You design your questionnaire and you start. But at the end of the day, let's assume, based on the example you mentioned, your minimum sample size for cases was 50. And at the end of the day, you get, let's assume your minimum sample size was 80. And at the end of the day, you eventually got half of those cases, but then you achieved control, because you will not be, while you're carrying out your study, you are still instituting the control measures. So if at the end of the day it's not up to that, does that make it something that you should not publish? Because you still might have lessons that you learned. And there could be, because your interest here is not for the general factors responsible for cholera. The focus in field epidemiology is for the triggers for that particular outbreak, which might be something that will be of interest to the scientific community. So what do you do in such a case? It's not adequately powered, but you've achieved some degree of numbers that you want to share. Thank you. Over.
Great. So in outbreak response, as likely know, the bar on which we operate, or the principles upon which we operate, are quite different from just academic research. And we don't have such a strict bar or strict law for p-values, right? So a lot of things we do in the field, you will never have the adequate sample size. So what we are necessarily looking for during context like that is, does this result trend towards this particular direction, right? Because we're looking at two things, right? The magnitude and the direction of the association. The magnitude might say, oh, cases were 1.5 times more likely to report this than controls, right? And the direction is consistently in that direction, that it's, this increases the odds of that. Now, am I going to say no, because the p-value is not less than 0.05, so I'm not going to do anything? No, the evidence is clear that it's in the direction that I imagine. And so in that context, yes, we definitely publish it, and definitely implement control measures to curb the outbreak of interest. Now, unfortunately, however, publishing is a different business entirely. Academic publishing specifically wants very specific p-values and things of that nature. So it's not there's no, you can't say don't try, but you might just have a hard time being able to publish those kind of papers, because it doesn't fit the standards that most journals have. So the best thing in those kind of cases will be to interpret the results more qualitatively. That means that we're not necessarily focused on p-values, and of course, you're going to be very transparent at the beginning. Transparent by saying that this study was underpowered, and so the major focus was to analyze the results and interpret the results qualitatively. So we can say, oh, things are going in this direction, and so this could just inform efforts for future studies, as opposed to saying, well, this is the result. So I think that's one way you could go about it. But in general, as you might know, journals are less enthusiastic about things from the field, especially when they don't reach that threshold of significance. But operations in the field are a different beast entirely. So we use them, and we make evidence, and we mount responses where we can. But publishing, it's a different story entirely. All right, I think there's one more question raised, one more hand raised. Napo?
Hi, Prof. Good evening, everyone, and Dr. Nkosi. And thanks for a great session, as always. Prof, my question squares to quantitative data. However, I got stuck with responses, but when I looked at Chi-square platform, it allows you to collected questionnaires by paper. It allows you to upload them, but I really don't know how to go about doing that. Can anybody help me?
Yeah, so you can email us, and then we can follow up with you on that. Maybe they might have office hours on that, but that's something that could be arranged.
What do you say I must send, Prof?
You can email at info@chisquares.com so that the team can arrange perhaps office hours or answer your question more to greater in depth.
But is it something that's doable via Chisquares?
Oh yes, it is. Yes.
Okay, thanks a lot, Prof. I'll do that tomorrow.
All right, awesome.
Thank you.
All right. So Lungi, I guess we're all set.
One last question.
Sure.
One last question. The difference between sample size and effect size.
Okay. Sample size is a number of, in terms of counts, number of people that we need. Effect size is it's not a count measure. It's saying, now what good analogy will I use to give this now? Okay, I can't come up with a good analogy. So, but effect size means, think of it as an odds ratio or a prevalence ratio or a means difference, right? Those are measures of association. The sample size is now saying how many people do we need to achieve this, if that makes any sense. So they're both numbers. One is the count, the other one is a numeric variable that could be continuous, since it will have infinite number of decimals. One is saying this is the number of people we need to achieve this. It's like you're trying to push a bus, right? And you want to move, the bus doesn't work anymore, it's dead. And you want to move it this far. The question is, how many people do we need to push that bus to move it that far? That far is the effect size we're trying to talk about. And the number of people that need to achieve that result is the sample size. So we need the sample size to achieve the effect size. So I hope that makes sense. I finally came up with an illustration, so I hope you understand it. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Please, have you answered the following question? Would a cross-sectional study be more ideal for evaluating prevalence? Don't worry, this is the last one, Prof.
I didn't complain. A cross-sectional study would be appropriate. Evaluation prevalence. That is hilarious. I didn't even complain.
Your face said it all.
Oh, really?
Okay. All right. So yeah, I think that's that. Did you answer that question?
Yeah, I did.
Give one.
I said yeah.
No explanation.
That will do. Please, you can go ahead and explain further.
You normally take like 15 minutes to answer one question, and then suddenly it's just one word.
Those days are gone. Well, now the domain of one-worded answers.
Low energy. I understand. Thank you. You've done very well. Thank you.
All right. Bye, everyone. See you tomorrow.
Thanks, Prof. Bye.
Bye. Same time tomorrow.
Bye. Thank you very much.
Bye. Thank you all. Thank you all for attending.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Hello, Dr. Ben.
Yes, I'm fully around.